Greetings, thanks for tuning in. My name is Lars Teeny. I'm a self-published author and student of history, science, and politics. Over the years, I've consumed countless articles, documentaries, and books on the subjects related to environmental damage to the earth. These subjects are overwhelming because it seems like for every product and industry, there is an adverse effect on the environment. I wanted to make a feel-good, light-hearted video about top 10 most adverse impacts of human activity on the environment. So obviously this video is bound to make people super happy. So if you find yourself about to suffer an overdose of joy, I would advise to pause the video and take a deep breath. And without further ado, I will begin the list. I decided I would start with the most obvious impact from human activity. At number 10, we have the burning of fossil fuels. Car culture in America. Nothing symbolizes the glory days of American hegemony more than cruising down the open road in a gas-guzzling car. In fact, American lifestyle and infrastructure had been engineered since nearly the automobile's inception to encourage citizens to get around in this fashion, at the expense of other sustainable and more efficient forms of transportation. Now that China and India have developed middle classes that want into the hot car action, that, according to World Future Society's website, the global fleet of cars will increase to 1 billion by the year 2020. Now, as we speak, a typical car emits 4.7 metric tons of carbon dioxide each year, according to the EPA. Now, if you multiply this figure by 800 million cars on Earth, you can start to see the magnitude of the problem. Fossil fuels are known as greenhouse gases because of its ability to trap the sun's heat like a greenhouse does. This excess heat contributes to melting ice caps and glaciers, alters jet streams and weather patterns, and interrupts animal breeding habits, food sources, and habitats. If the car emissions were bad enough, the emissions of factory coal-fired power plants and methane emissions from livestock farming only compound the issue, and the escape of millions of metric tons of methane from melting permafrost that has been trapped for thousands of years, and the problem becomes monumental. And of course, the most pervasive impact that humans will have to live with in terms of the consequences of melting ice caps is rising sea level. Already, island nations in the South Pacific are feeling the effects, with some atolls being evacuated before being swallowed by the sea. Number 9. The impacts of hydraulic fracturing. As you all may or may not know, the United States is the world's top oil producer, specifically because of the sheer amount of fracking activity that occurs in the U.S. at present. According to journalistsource.org, the United States went from producing roughly 500,000 barrels a day in 2008 to producing 4 million barrels a day by 2014. This huge increase can be largely attributed to the proliferation of fracking technology throughout the country. The Obama administration and many other politicians have been staunch proponents of fracking and its benefits to the economy it provides in terms of job creation. They have also argued that fracking decreases American dependence on foreign oil produced by shady regimes, but at what cost? The obvious cost is to the environment, and that impact has been the subject of controversy as local populations try to get the word out about the negative impacts of fracking, while big industry works to downplay the impacts and tout the benefits. According to journalistsresource.org, 2 studies of drinking water of a total of 209 homes overlaying the Marcellus Shale in Pennsylvania found evidence of hydrocarbon pollution and 17 times higher methane concentrations for the homes. This shows that shallow aquifers are at highest risk of contamination. Beyond groundwater supply risk, U.S. oil and gas operations generate more than 2 billion gallons of wastewater daily that contain toxic levels of elements such as barium, arsenic, and radioactive radium. Beyond this, 95% of wastewater is injected deep underground, which often leads to aquifers being contaminated due to seismic activity, which ironically can be caused by the wastewater injection itself. Add in the water requirements, a single well can require 2 to 20 million gallons of water, and the air pollution impacts, and then you have a winning combination that clinches the number 9 spot on this list. Number 8. The impacts of overfishing, depleted fisheries throughout the world. Everyone I know loves seafood. The popularity of sushi has skyrocketed worldwide in the last several decades, and that shrimp cocktail is always a hit at parties. And of course, salmon is one of my favorite foods. Indeed, with such a high demand for seafood by foodies in developed countries, as well as the millions of people worldwide in poorer countries that live in coastal regions who rely on seafood for survival, this means that the oceans of the world are being depleted like never before. According to the World Wildlife Foundation, 3 billion people worldwide rely on both wild-caught and farmed seafood as their primary source of protein. As small-scale and regional fisheries gave way to large industrial fishing, profit margins and demand soared. Through the 20th century, seafood gained in popularity in cuisine. Now, the United Nations Food and Agricultural Organization estimates that 85% of marine fish stocks are either fully exploited or overfished. Exacerbating this already serious problem is the phenomenon known as bycatch. Bycatch is what happens when non-target species are caught when they become hooked or trapped when attracted to bait or target catch, or cannot avoid capture or entanglement in fishing gear. Although there are practices in place to reduce bycatch, it remains a widespread problem the world over. According to the Consortium for Wildlife, every year at least 7.3 million tons of marine life are caught incidentally. In many cases, the scale of mortality is so high that it threatens the survival of species and their environment, and in some cases, the percentage of bycatch far outweighs the amount of target catch. The CFW goes on to state that for every shrimp caught by nets dragged behind trawls in the Gulf of Mexico, over 4 times its weight is bycatch. That's almost like saying a dolphin has to die for every dozen salmon caught. Furthermore, as the intensity of fishing does not let up, as adult individuals are caught and the fish populations are not allowed to recover, the result is that younger and smaller fish are targeted and caught, threatening fishery collapse. Also, as desired species go extinct or become more scarce, commercial fishers will switch to previously non-desirable species, which leads to interrupting delicate food chains. Lastly, overfishing leads to the emptying of the sea of target species, which leave behind niches that are just waiting to be filled by less desirable species. An article on redorbit.com states, tuna, sea turtles, and other jellyfish predators are disappearing due to overfishing. While that helps the jellyfish, they are truly taking advantage of the overfishing of small pelagic or open ocean fish. Fish such as sardines, herrings, anchovies, and others feed off of zooplankton, making them the main competition for food. Small fish such as these also eat jellyfish eggs and larvae, acting as a regulating force on the population. In areas where the fish are depleted due to overfishing, an ecological niche is opened for the jellyfish, and they are fully filling it. Number 7. Industrialized agriculture, GMO crops, and its impacts on the environment and biodiversity. Progress. The golden age of American hegemony after World War II ushered in an era where the need for a larger food supply intersected with experimental and booming chemical industry. Industrial agriculture featured enormous single-crop farms and animal production facilities, which were hailed as a technological marvel by policymakers, scientists, and farmers in the decades after World War II. Monoculture, as it is known, concentrates heavily on the production of a single cash crop like corn, wheat, soybeans, cotton, and rice, at the expense of crop variety. American culture was heavily engineered to adhere to a lifestyle revolving around consuming products derived from these cash crops. If you're an old fart like me, you'll remember the food pyramid that used to be taught in school. Because wheat was a star crop, they conditioned consumers to eat bread, cereal, rice, pasta more than any other food daily. Corn was used in the production of high fructose corn syrup. This sweetening agent, of course, is used in everything from soda pop to ketchup. Monoculture crops require the use of synthetic fertilizer because the intensive production cycles deplete the soil of nutrients, and so they need to be replenished somehow. Also, toxic pesticides are used because monocultural fields are highly attractive to certain weeds and insects. Corn, for instance, is produced from corn seed treated with neonicotinoid insecticides. According to the Union of Concerned Scientists website, neonicotinoids, have been recently associated with honeybee colony collapse disorder and other bee mortality, and about 35% of U.S. crops rely on bees and other pollinators to be productive. So, if the bees go, then so does our diverse food sources. And for those who don't know, the neonicotinoid insecticides are those like Roundup. Now, one of the biggest driving forces behind monoculture farming and genetically modified crops is the highly popular company Monsanto. Arguably, they have done the most to advance genetically modified organism crop farming, going as far as patenting their seeds, forcing farmers to grow their crops through legal means, and suing farmers who do not use their seeds but have found that crop strains patented by Monsanto have blown into their fields from neighboring farms. Biotech crops also affect biodiversity in other ways. According to Doug Gurian-Sherman of the Union of Concerned Scientists, genetically engineering ups the ante when it comes to the potential for harm to wildlife from gene flow, because organisms in natural ecosystems have not adapted to many of the genes used in field trials. With the recent approval of genetically engineered alfalfa in the United States, organic farmers here are even more concerned about such a genetic trespass. So basically, how I see it, the same thing is happening to non-GMO crops with regards to GMO crop invasion as to what is theorized that happened to the Neanderthals when modern humans came on the scene. They were outcompeted and outbred from existence. On top of these impacts, there are the issues of water use, land use, and agricultural runoff. First, in places like California, which has been suffering from a record drought for 5 years, the massive agricultural-based economy there demands massive quantities of water, and the water usage has worsened the drought. In a world of rising human populations, cities are getting bigger and sprawling further into traditionally farmland. As cities get bigger, the more food the city consumes, and thus more farmland is needed. But when the cities swallow up the prime farmland, oftentimes less desirable land is then converted to agricultural use. This is a major problem in places like Brazil, where 40% of the Brazilian Amazon rainforest has been cleared for farms. Lastly, farm runoff from fertilizer and pesticides and animal waste can contaminate groundwater, rivers, lakes, and coastal waters. Specifically, the runoff from animal waste sends nutrients into freshwater bodies that causes algae blooms on the surface. These blooms, in turn, block out the sun and deplete oxygen from the water, resulting in the death of all the life forms below. These are called dead zones. Number 6. Plastic litter biodegrading into microbeads and polluting the world's oceans. Now, plastic has many uses. Bags, Tupperware, disposable cutleries, water bottles, molded plastics used in electronics, and many other uses. The problem with plastics, beyond the litter you see on the side of the highway, is that plastic does not biodegrade, but instead it breaks down into smaller units called microbeads. These microbeads of plastic may wind up at sea, where they float through the world's oceans and can be collected in sea ice and wash up on remote islands. In 2012 alone, 288 million metric tons of plastic were produced worldwide. According to the Student Society for Science, 10% of the plastic produced winds up in the ocean. They cited a study that found as much as 8 million metric tons wound up in the ocean in 2010. Quote, "How much plastic is that? 5 plastic bags filled with plastic for every foot of coastline in the world," end quote. So much of the plastic reaches the ocean via rivers and streams or from ocean-going vessels and fishing ships. That makes water and soda bottles usually sink to the bottom, but most other plastics like milk jugs, detergent bottles, and styrofoam float along the surface. All that plastic churning around in the oceans are carried on circular currents called gyres. They then will amass mass in patches where currents converge. The largest of these patches is around twice the size of Texas or bigger, and has been dubbed the Great Pacific Garbage Patch. The plastic is broken down into smaller units by ocean waves and the sun's ultraviolet rays. Once the plastic does break down so small and is abundant in the ocean, it is bound to enter the food web. It starts with zooplankton swallowing the small beads of plastic. These microscopic animals basically are an important food source for larger fish and whales. The Student Society for Science cited research conducted by Matthew Cole, a biologist at the University of Exeter in England. Quote, his research team collected zooplankton from the English Channel. In the lab, the experts added polystyrene beads to the tank of water holding the zooplankton. Polystyrene is found in styrofoam and other brands of foam. After 24 hours, the team examined the zooplankton under a microscope. 13 of the 15 zooplankton species had swallowed the beads. End quote. Now, zooplankton are very low on the food chain and are an important food source for whales and fish. And the swallowing of the beads by the zooplankton weakened them and reduced their population. Also, if they become scarcer, it will affect whale and fish populations in turn. On top of all this, larger fish, crabs, lobsters, and marine worms are also ingesting the plastic, which affect the health of these species, and if they become prey to a predator, means they provide less of a nutritious meal and pass the plastic along up the food chain, ultimately being ingested by you and I at the sushi bar. As you may or may not know, plastic food in Japan for window displays is actually an art form. They are ahead of the curve on this one. At number 5, we have the impacts of deforestation for lumber, farms, mines, and other development. Wood has been a key material for development of civilization and the survival of many humans throughout the ages. Goods made from wood usually denote luxury and quality. Indeed, both the rich and the poor rely heavily on wood products for a wide variety of uses. The downside of this is that wood comes from trees. Trees compose forests, and forests are needed to make air. Forests, as we know, occupy huge portions of the land of the earth, and thus are natural barriers to urban development and resource extraction. One large tree can produce enough oxygen for 2 adult humans, so you could imagine that it would be beneficial for humans to leave forests intact. Historically, humans have had a terrible record of leaving forests untouched. Europe had lost much of its forests during the medieval and colonial periods, and the Middle East lost many forests way back in antiquity. Even the Maya of the Central America are theorized to have collapsed by harvesting all their forests for the production of stucco used on their pyramids. Unfortunately, humanity has not changed their bad habits. In America, construction using wood is still widely popular and cheap, and America has fairly strict standards when it comes to logging in forests, but most of the rest of the world does not. According to LiveScience.com, half the world's tropical forests have been cleared. Also, forests currently cover about 30% of the world's landmass, and forest loss contributes between 6 and 12% of annual global carbon dioxide emissions. Lastly, about 36 football fields worth of trees are lost every minute. These are some staggering statistics. So, most of this destructive forest loss occurs in countries like Brazil, Indonesia, Thailand, and the Democratic Republic of Congo, as well as other parts of Africa, Asia, and Eastern Europe. NASA estimates that if the current rate of deforestation proceeds, that the world's rainforests will be totally gone in about 100 years. Although Americans might feel proud about heavy restrictions in place to protect our national forests, it may be a case of too little too late, since the continental United States has lost 90% of its indigenous forests since the year 1600. The most common causes of deforestation are mainly making land available for housing and urbanization, harvesting timber for commercial items like paper, furniture, and homes, creating ingredients that are high demand for consumers like palm oil, and to free up land for cattle ranching. The most common methods of deforestation is burning trees and clear cutting, and the most pervasive impacts of deforestation are numerous. The most obvious is that it is contributing to climate change. With massive quantities of greenhouse gases being released into the atmosphere, the obvious counter would be an abundance of trees to absorb carbon dioxide and release oxygen. Deforestation lessens the amount of carbon stored and releases carbon dioxide into the air. Other impacts of deforestation are loss of species, as 70% of the plants and animals live in forests, and they lose their habitats to deforestation. This can lessen the potential of medical breakthroughs and affects local populations who rely on animals and plants in forests for survival. Another impact is on the water cycle. Trees absorb rainfall and produce vapor that is released into the atmosphere that helps to stop polluted water runoff. Trees are indeed nature's Brita water filter. On top of that, trees also help keep soil erosion in check. The roots of trees dig deep into the soil to anchor themselves and thus secure the soil. But once the trees are gone, the soil is washed or blown away, which causes vegetation growth problems. According to the WWF, scientists estimate that a third of the world's arable land has been lost to deforestation since 1960. This cycle leads to desertification of previously productive land, landslides, and flooding because the forest no longer absorbs and holds rainwater. But yeah, stupid tree huggers. Who needs trees anyway, right? Number 4, the impacts of war. There is probably no more of a rapidly destructive force on Earth than the practice of war. I'm not talking about low-level or guerrilla conflicts. I'm talking about full-scale conventional war. Entire societies are mobilized for the sole purpose of bringing death and destruction to their enemies. Although war has been with humanity since the beginning, and is just an extension of base animal instincts, warfare reached its destructive peak in the 20th century when total war was introduced as the norm. No longer were civilian populations spared as bystanders. In the world wars, cities and civilians would be considered legitimate targets. This practice began in the 19th century, for instance, with Sherman's March during the American Civil War. By World War I, the theory went that if a nation makes the war as brutal as possible for the enemy, then a war would be cut short because it was believed that the enemy would be demoralized and would be forced to make peace. Of course, we all know that wasn't the case, and World War I would drag on and claim millions of lives. The full impact of this war is still visible in Western Europe, where the vast trench networks can still be seen and artillery barrage craters still scar the landscape 100 years later. By the outbreak of World War II, civilians and cities were all part of the war machine, and both the Axis and the Allied powers targeted civilians and committed atrocities. One of the most obvious impacts of World War II was the severe loss of life. World War II resulted in the death of 3% of the world's population, mostly being Chinese and Russian casualties. According to an author manuscript published on the National Center for Biotechnology Information website, 34 million people were killed in Europe alone. Of course, death toll from combat is a short-term impact. Other short-term impacts include homelessness, disease, hunger, and poverty. All throughout World War II, there was a massive refugee crisis. According to the American Catholic University of America website, it is estimated that through the entire wartime, that the number of European civilians displaced for whatever reason was at 60 million. Countries had literally been destroyed in this conflict. Industries disrupted, infrastructure severed, and resources depleted. Anything of value would have been looted, and livestock and foodstuffs consumed. Also, there would be a plethora of long-term impacts from total war. First, there would be psychological impacts from those living through war for civilians and soldiers alike. PTSD and depression are chronic problems for survivors. Also, in the case of post-World War II Germany, so many males had died in the war that the sex ratio in the country was hugely altered. According to the article posted on the National Center for Biotechnology Information, quote, in Germany, about 1 in 4 children lived without their biological fathers when they were age 10 during the war, end quote. Not to mention that German women had to live with the trauma of being raped by Soviet soldiers at the end of World War II. Another long-term effect of Total war is the altered environment caused by bombing, artillery, and camps and supply depots. During wartime, being green is the last thing on a military's mind, so waste is dumped or burned wherever the hell. Also, unspent ordnances and landmines are a constant threat. Years after the war has ended, for instance, one only needs to look at Vietnam. According to a 2012 article published on the Guardian website, quote, the Vietnamese government estimates that around 15% of the total surface area of the country is contaminated by unexploded ordnances, and for Quang Tri province, nestled as it is on the wartime division between what was once North and South Vietnam, the contamination is closer to 84%, end quote. These facts make farming an incredibly hazardous occupation in Vietnam. Nothing else mentioned on this list quite matches the potential impact of nearly instant global destruction than that of nuclear weapons and what they are capable of. One just needs to take a look at what happened to the Japanese cities of Hiroshima and Nagasaki for confirmation. Number 3, the altered environment that dams have created. Dams are another example of feats of engineering that have been celebrated over the years for the benefits they bring to regions so that development can occur. Dams in the past have made possible to create vast water reserves in order to make deserts bloom and allowed people to live where they shouldn't be able to. Dams have also been a source of cheap power, and some would argue a green alternative to fossil fuel burning. However, as this list is a testament to, human progress often has its downside. According to internationalrivers.org, there are 40,000 large dams worldwide. In China alone, there are 19,000 large dams. These numbers do not include the many thousands of smaller dams worldwide. You can imagine the impact that dams have on river-spawning species of fish like salmon and steelhead. These species must travel upriver to mate and lay eggs, but dams impede their progress, even though there are bypass channels in some cases. For example, according to Scientific American, wild salmon numbers in the Pacific Northwest's Columbia River Basin are down by 85% since big dams were built a half-century ago. Now, dams have literally transformed the landscape for better or worse, like near the Colorado River, where the Hoover Dam allows Las Vegas to exist and grow. Dams alter ecosystems, turning floodplains and marshes into grassland by blocking natural water flows, and turn desert into farmland or city by allowing a water supply that wouldn't normally be there to exist. Another impact of dams and their ability to block natural flows is that water is not the only objects that are stopped. Organic materials that naturally wash downstream build up behind dams and begin to consume large quantities of oxygen as they decompose. The lack of oxygen, in turn, may cause algae blooms, which further deplete the oxygen and block the sun, leading to dead zones, where life has been snuffed out. Also, water temperature differs greatly in dam reservoirs between surface and depth. According to scientificamerican.com, quote, this complicates survival for marine life evolves to handle natural temperature cycling. And when dam operators release oxygen-deprived water with unnatural temperatures into the river below, they harm downstream environments as well. End quote. Of course, there exists the possibility of dam failures that would consume entire cities and would waste massive quantities of stored water. It has happened in the past. In 1905, work began to divert the Colorado River when river water broke through diversion canals in the irrigation system of Imperial County. This created the Salton Sea of Southern California. It also destroyed railways and towns when it happened. In the 60s, the Salton Sea hosted resorts, but those resorts have been abandoned as the sea is slowly disappearing, and all that is left are post-apocalyptic ruins from the once thriving resorts. Number 2, the impacts of urban sprawl, the paving over of everything in sight. Americans love their strip malls, their Walmarts, their fast food, and their tract housing. These aspects have become woven into American culture. Many of us have grown up with the trauma of the suburbs in our pasts, and for many, the suburbs offer a pseudo small-town comfort. To many others, suburban developments symbolize isolation and artificial veneers of life. Aside from perceived cultural stigmas attached to urban sprawl, there are actually measurable negative impacts associated with urban sprawl itself. I will attempt to cover the most pervasive of them. Aside from the obvious lack of efficient use of space associated with American city design, urban sprawl also competes and threatens wildlife habitats and farmland. As property values grow and city demand more food and resources to grow, the amount of land required to sustain cities also increases, in tandem with the surface area of land required to accommodate growing populations and their structures. According to lifescience.com, quote, 3% of the world's surface is covered with urban areas, an increase of at least 50% over previous estimates, end quote. The Global Rural Urban Mapping Project, or GRUMP, came to these findings by combining satellite images of urban lights at night with population data that painted the most accurate picture to date. They found that coastal settlements had the highest population densities. The most densely populated coastal cities are located in Africa and Asia, and 7% of urban dwellers now reside in the world's largest megacities. Also, according to NASA, quote, more than half the world's expected 9 billion people will live in giant urban expanses by 2030. Their hinterlands are expected to occupy an additional 1.2 million square kilometers, thereby tripling in size, end quote. It is forecasted that mainly in India, China, and Africa that megacities will continue to grow and spread until they connect into urban corridors similar to those found between Boston and Washington, D.C. in the U.S. The problem with this is that the urban corridors would run right through biodiversity hotspots. According to Scientific American, quote, the eastern Afro-Montane Guinea forests of West Africa and western Ghats of India, along with Sri Lanka, are all home to such biodiversity as well as projected to undergo rapid urban expansion that will encroach on the territory of already endangered amphibians, birds, and mammals, end quote. Another forecasted impact of such development would be even more greenhouse gas emissions that contribute to climate change. According to Scientific American, quote, an estimated 1.38 billion metric tons of carbon could be released as forest transforms to roads, buildings, and homes, end quote. Beyond the forecasted impact of urban corridors are the real and measurable impacts occurring now. For all the sleek and ultra-modern skylines constructed, more common are sprawling slums or older neighborhoods that are neglected by development. According to the UN Habitat, the number of people living in slum conditions is now estimated at 863 million, in contrast to 760 million in 2000 and 650 million in 1990. These conditions, of course, have numerous ramifications on health for these people, not to mention psychological and social impacts of living in poverty. The sad part about all this growth of megacities and urban corridors is that it may actually be necessary, because if villagers and tribespeople can no longer make a living due to subsistence farming but are too poor to afford proper city dwellings, that they will be forced most likely into unplanned settlements that rely on illegal land use, where the general lack of infrastructure, public facilities, and basic services will eat up more natural resources and habitats. Imagine the city planet of Coruscant from Star Wars, except instead of a futuristic city, it would be a filth-covered teeming slum. But a planet covered with one of those giant cities would not be technologically feasible, so I digress. At the number one spot, we have the root cause of all these impacts on our list: overpopulation from humans. So now that we have covered all the 9 other impacts of human activity that affect the environment, it's time to talk about the root cause of them all, and the most pervasive impact of one specific human activity: sex. Yes, it's no secret that humans mate like rabbits, or humans. Everyone does it, and most humans will eventually have offspring. Everyone knows there is a problem with overpopulation as they feel it in everyday life, which leads to people searching for the cause of the problem, often scapegoating certain groups as the culprit. But the truth is that overpopulation is a human problem and not attributed just to one specific group. Overpopulation demands increasing amounts of resources and lands to accommodate the ever-growing number of people alive, and with poor sanitation and ever-increasing population densities, poor health and epidemic disease often follows. Another impact of overpopulation is the evolution of superbugs, or drug-resistant bacteria and viruses which cause major diseases. This is because the vast amount of human hosts available in a small area, as well as the overuse of antibiotics in hospitals and clinics. Many scientists and policymakers agree that steps need to be taken to curb out-of-control population. However, there are barriers to even taking action. The two main barriers I propose are capitalism and religion. It is no secret that markets within the American system of capitalism rely on ever-expanding profit margins in order to keep from sinking into a depression. I propose the method for doing this is to grow the pool of consumers with purchasing power. It is in capitalism's interest to keep the population growing at a steady rate so that the consumer base keeps increasing. In a similar manner, religion, particularly Abrahamic faiths, rely on increasing populations in order to grow adherence to the faith. However, religion protects reproduction as a sacred and sanctified practice, and so religious officials often resist efforts to control population growth with religious zeal. Both business and religious interests often find common ground and work together to politicize these issues, creating needless controversy over scientific evidence that oftentimes results in political gridlock and uncertainty. In an era where truth no longer matters, and oftentimes whoever barks the loudest and most frequently gets heard, it seems that humanity is in for a bleak future, but only time will tell. On a more cheerful note, that about wraps up this video. Thank you for watching. Let me know if you agree, disagree, or think I overlooked something in the comments. Please subscribe to this channel if you enjoyed this video, and of course I will see you next time.